Good afternoon now. Welcome to our panel on Open Strategic Autonomy, where we want to explore with a great panel how this concept really works in practice. But before I turn to the panel, I would like to briefly quote from the opening statement yesterday of Executive Vice President Margrethe Vestager, who covered the issue in a few sentences. Horizon Europe will continue to welcome partners from all over the world and to encourage cooperation with specific partners in key areas. At the same time, we see that some areas of the world do not share our values and principles or do not have the same respect for fairness and reciprocity in our relations. So we need to balance our openness with safeguards to protect our European interest and our open autonomy. Anyone is welcome to be a partner as long as they share our values and act on fair, equal terms. Getting this balance right on the basis of a dialogue with our partners will be a key task in the months ahead as we launch and implement Horizon Europe. I think this is really the task for you as a panel. The Executive Vice President now set it out. I don't think I can do it better. So let me move straight into the discussion with Susanne Burger. Susanne, welcome. You are Director General for European and International Cooperation in the Ministry in Berlin. We have Reinhard Bütikofer, member of the European Parliament, and you are the chair of the Delegation for Relations with the People's Republic of China, amongst other responsibilities. I'm delighted to have my fellow Director General and friend Roberto Viola, Director General of DG Connect, and last but not least, Kurt de Ketelare. Kurt is also a friend and is the Secretary General of the League of European Research Universities. So really quite the panel, as you can see. So let me kick off, Susanne, directly with you. We are discussing this concept of open strategic autonomy. You are very familiar with us. It should enable us to build resilience in order to remain as open as possible. It's a search for balance, as I just emphasized. This being said, it's not completely clear what it means in practice. So what do we mean, or what do you mean, Susanne, when we speak of open strategic autonomy? Over to you.
Yes, thank you, Jean-Eric, and welcome to everyone outside this room, and of course to the other colleagues in the panel. Yes, I think that the pandemic was triggering the discussion about strategic autonomy in a very remarkable way, because then we noticed that we are so dependent in many fields that we have to think of how to strengthen autonomy, strategic autonomy, especially also in the technological sense. And so we in our ministry, we published a discussion paper on strategic autonomy in close cooperation with stakeholders and associations. And when we analyzed the concept of technological sovereignty as an important element of strategic autonomy, we discovered that evidently sovereignty and autonomy are not possible without transnational cooperation. Germany and Europe are not only dependent on integration into international markets, but also on access to the international knowledge hub and innovation hubs if we want to compete with countries like the US or China. And consequently, the challenge is to transform knowledge produced across the globe into competitive European products and services. And there we should remember that most R&I-driven knowledge is produced today outside Europe. And so we should in no case decouple ourselves from the global knowledge production. And therefore, we strongly promote the openness of any EU research and innovation funding. And of course, we like to share and cooperate in this respect with partners that share our values, like Commissioner Vestager pointed out. The question is how to deal with countries that not necessarily share our values, and this is probably the difficult question we have to face today. We support the Commission's intention to significantly strengthen international cooperation, and at the same time, we understand and share the Commission's interest to protect strategic assets and autonomy or security of the European Union. And in times of geopolitical tensions, where key technologies are increasingly seen as sources of power, we need to find the right balance between openness and protection of our interests by reducing dependencies and strengthening our autonomy and developing technological sovereignty, particularly in these key technologies. And when we cooperate with international parties on a bilateral base, we very closely look at the topics that we are willing to cooperate with them in the future. And later I can be probably more going more into details. In fact, autonomy does not mean isolation. And on the contrary, the transnational exchange of knowledge, innovation, and labor contributes to our technological sovereignty. So my last comment here is that at the end of the day, we should focus now our discussions on not only on the abstract concepts of open strategic autonomy or technological sovereignty, but on concrete cases and on concrete technologies. And I'm looking forward to the next discussions. Thank you.
Susanne, thank you very much. This, I think, kicks us off very, very well. And you made, I think, a very good case for the openness of European programs, member state programs, and of course, Horizon Europe. There is no doubt that excellence cuts across borders, and excellence, I think, thrives in this global context. This being said, the limitations, I think, exist as well. If I can now turn, Roberto, to you. We have been discussing strategic autonomy also in the context of the preparations of the work program for Horizon Europe. So I think it's quite a concrete illustration of this discussion, and in particular around quantum, but I don't want to limit you to quantum, Roberto. But in your work, you are dealing with very sensitive technologies in your area of work. So how do you see that concept from the point of view of your policy?
Thank you, Jean-Eric, and many thanks really for inviting me to this very important discussion. I think open strategic autonomy might sound as an oxymoron, but it's not. And indeed, you're posing the right question. What does it mean concretely? I think concretely means that we want to maintain the full package when it comes to Europe. The full package means values, democracy, and economic growth. And one should not be excluding the other. And in order to do that, we need to make sure the key technologies are available to European citizens and companies. What does it mean in concrete? It means that if quantum, to take the example you quoted, quantum is the future for Europe. It's the future of computation, it's the future of communication, is clearly the next breakthrough in terms of technology. And I think there's no doubt we want a quantum computer available for our scientists and for our companies. There's no doubt that we want for our... And we want to make sure that companies can profit for the best technologies. Now, as a matter of fact, today we have a situation by which our scientists cannot have the guarantee to have a quantum computer, because certain technologies, when they come to the higher, so to say, TRLs, are not available for export. And this is an issue. So we cannot be open at the basic level and then get a problem at the higher level when it comes to, realizing things. So we must make sure that when we partner and we want to partner, and that's the openness part, then this deal is fair. And it's reciprocity. Reciprocity is very important. Our factories, car factories, our medical device factories are suffering because there's a lack of supply of chips. This is really impairing the capability of Europe to produce. This is not acceptable. Now, one solution, and I think this is a solution which we must have, is to increase chip production in Europe, but of course also to enlarge our portfolio of partnerships. So there's not one way to deliver autonomy. Indeed, there are multiple ways, and it's a combination. It's a combination of being stronger, technologically speaking, in Europe, and also being smarter when it comes to partnership. And I think by combining the two, we have the openness of that we want to have, but at the same time, we maintain the understanding, the control, the mastership of technologies which will shape our future.
Roberto, thank you very much. And we are indeed in the context of now the implementation of the work programs looking at a number of criteria, reciprocity, protection of our interests, IP-related matters, on which we will seek reassurances from key partners, which we would want to work, but we need that framework in place. And that, I think, is now really bringing us to how to do it. What should be the criteria? And if I can turn to Mr. Bütikofer and Kurt Deketelare, do you think we should work on a list of sensitive technologies where these safeguards are relevant? So deciding maybe at the outset what is sensitive or not. Should we maybe mirror industrial policy considerations? Should we allow commercial interest to be part of the discussion? I mean, I don't know if you see the Slido page yourselves, but there are already questions coming up on which criteria should be used, even with the audience asking whether values would just be one key criteria, or do we need more of those? So, Mr. Bütikofer, how do you see these criteria to preserve our strategic autonomy?
Thank you, first of all, Director General, for including me in this conversation. I would say that in order to balance, or as the communication of May says, in order to rebalance our approach, we first have to start with acknowledging that not all our partners are just the same. There is obviously an increasingly tense competition, but some of the players in this competition are also systemic rivals. And it is, I think, an obvious fact that we have to make a distinction whether we are dealing with like-minded partners or whether partners do not necessarily share our values or the principles of transparency or reciprocity or other core concerns. So I would say, first of all, let's start from that realistic assumption. We want to stay open, but we have to keep our eyes open in order to stay open. And there have been other examples in the past where Commission was confronted with similar questions. I recall that Commission, for instance, in 2009, came up with a criticality analysis for industrial raw materials. And that criticality analysis looked at different angles. It looked at the risk level. It looked also at the relevancy level. And I think that is an approach that can be mirrored. Obviously, the relevancy also plays out in different dimensions. There is an economic relevancy. There is also a security dimension to the relevancy of all these issues. I think the notion of economic security has been underrated around the EU for a while. We should give that more emphasis. And then, of course, what kind of a list would we produce? Certainly, it would not make any sense, at least as far as I'm concerned, to try to completely fence off some of the technologies. The basic philosophy of the EU has always been stronger together. That's the basis for openness, for our principle of openness. So no dystopian approach that says, let's create walls. On the other hand, we cannot maybe exclude that the technological development will force us to reassess such a list. So let's be flexible and base this also on a very broadly based public conversation. And that's why I believe that not just the scientific community, not just the administrators, also civil society, also the business community have to be included in that conversation.
So, Butikova, thank you very much. Indeed, this is absolutely the way we are trying to interact to ensure that we are getting it right. I hope there is no IP on your formula. We need to keep open eyes to remain open, because I like it a lot and I will certainly want to use it again. Kurt, on your side for Leru, you have your eyes wide open, I know. When we were starting to work on the Horizon Europe work programs, there was the perception outside that there would be a very large measure of closing off topics in the work programs. I mean, this ended up to be unfounded, and I think we all now know that it's really a very, very limited number of topics, a few dozen of topics out of 1,500 research topics. So a minimal fraction of it, which will be limited. But you were very critical at the time, which I think is good, because we need indeed actors of the research worlds to look at the way we are working. So, Kurt, maybe your views on how to do it to ensure that we remain fully open, because that's really the discussion. We want to remain fully open. So, where do we need to close to remain fully open?
Okay, thank you very much, Eric, and thank you for the invitation to be here again this morning. You were right that we have been worried about this issue, because it's an absolutely crucial issue. You know that I speak for 23 universities in Europe, which don't only play at national level, they don't only play at European level, but these are 23 institutions which really play at a global level. So playing at a global level, of course, also means that you must be aware of all kinds of potential limitations to your activities, which are coming up from all kinds of sides. And it was very good from you, Jean-Eric, to quote Margaretha Vestager, what she said yesterday, because obviously with Leru we are fully in line with what she has been putting forward there yesterday. You referred to the press release that we did earlier this year, in which we said we are fully in favor of international cooperation, and we say no to a blind EU first approach. And perhaps let me explain a little bit what we meant with that, because as you rightly say, Jean-Eric, afterwards, it's clear that the threat which was existing at that point in time when we were formulating this press release, the threat has now been reduced in an important way, and it's very good. It's also a sign that it is useful to raise every now and then your voice in a very explicit way. And we have done that because we are dealing here with a dangerous topic, I would say. And I don't only say that with my hat on as Secretary General of Leru, but I also say that as a law professor still. For us lawyers, it's clear that immediately when notions are launched as autonomy, technological sovereignty, and limitations to cooperation and to access to all kinds of things, that the lawyer within us, of course, start to think and see all kinds of problems. So this combination of being a lobbyist and a lawyer is not always a very reassuring thing for people with whom we are dealing. Let's say that the concept of this strategic autonomy is, of course, something that we are inheriting from defense policy, from trade policy. I've been checking a number of documents again yesterday in preparation for today, and where you see that in defense and trade policy, we always have been saying protecting ourselves from unfair and abusive practices. And it's clear that obviously we also don't have to tolerate those practices in research and innovation policy. What the Commission has been putting forward in its own communication on global cooperation, it's clear that the ideas of a level playing field and reciprocity are, of course, very important and are, of course, important starting points for any kind of collaboration. But at the same time, I would like to, certainly today, also warn for what is known in the literature as the risk of the autonomy trap. organizations which feel weak or which feel becoming weaker very often have this tendency to ask for more autonomy. And with asking for more autonomy, they often isolate themselves more than they already were. And then they became even more weaker, as a consequence of which they are even asking more autonomy. And at the end of the day, of course, they collapse. And it's clear that in EU research and innovation policy, we certainly cannot afford that kind of attitude, and we certainly have to avoid this autonomy trap, because we all know, as your services have indicated very clearly, Jean-Eric, international collaboration is the driving force for everything that we do. Solving societal problems is really based on this international cooperation. And that's why we said in this press release to which you refer to is it's good for the EU not to be naive. We earlier this week had a discussion in the framework of ERA, a discussion also on foreign interference. And also there, our institutions, companies, universities have to become less naive and more aware of potential threats. But at the same time, it should be careful not to swing too much to the other side. An overly protective EU-first activity, in my view, will weaken instead of defend EU research and innovation, and hence the whole competitiveness of our region. And I'm very pleased to see this also being translated in the ERA Council conclusions of December 2020, where international cooperation and science diplomacy is very much emphasized. I already referred to the Commission's communication on the global approach to research and innovation, and I've checked that yesterday again, and I see twice in the text this notion of strategic autonomy, but it's not that this strategic autonomy is all over the place in this document. I also feel in this document a certain doubt to what extent that this really can be a dominating concept in our global cooperation, which has been put forward. And obviously, we have included in Horizon Europe, in the regulation, Article 22.5, which should give us enough possibilities where it is needed and where we think that our values and our interests are at risk to take the necessary action. But at the same time, I remember from the negotiations on Horizon Europe, and you certainly will remember also that, Jean-Eric, that when we were discussing, when the Parliament was discussing the amendments which had been put forward by one of the rapporteurs and which were labeled as a kind of EU-first approach, that all of us, we all came together and we said, we don't want to have those amendments. And we all have been fighting against the adoption of those amendments, which clearly indicated an EU-first approach. And let me come to my final point, if I may, Jean-Eric. It's clear that what we have seen over the past few weeks on quantum and on space research is also not an example which is really reassuring about how this whole strategic autonomy is going to work in the future. Asking me today, what are the technologies that we have to protect? What are the criteria that we have to use? Well, I don't have a list that I just can submit like that. With regard to the criteria, it's clear that our democratic values and the goals that we want to realize as a European Union are absolutely criteria that we have to use. But the whole question will be, do we take a negative, protective approach, or do we take a positive, ambitious, and critical approach vis-à-vis the partners that we would like to team up with? And certainly for Leru, our approach is that we have to go for this positive, critical approach. As we have said in the past, we certainly don't want to come to the opposite result at the end of the day because of the fact that we are acting in a too much protective way, knowing that we need the outside world, outside of the European Union, to reach the goals that we want. And being a lawyer, I'm very sure that we can realize a lot with coming up with the necessary legal formulations in contracts, in regulations, vis-à-vis the partners that we want to team up with. If taking the advantage of Roberto being also on the call, if we can impose on the rest of the world GDPR, I think that we can impose much more on the rest of the world so that they comply with the norms and the rules that we want them to see to be respected.
Good, thank you very much. This was very rich. Thank you for for this presentation of the autonomy trap, which I think is very interesting and very powerful. And there is no doubt that we are not falling in that trap, as I think you all four have said very clearly. I mean, I'm starting to get questions, and I would like indeed now to move also to maybe a discussion on practical implementation, if we can. And I think I have at least 3 areas which I could cover with the panel. Maybe Roberto, you would agree in a moment to say a few words on how we will now move forward, taking the example of quantum and space. I mean, I already alluded to it, but we are working on it together. And of course, possibly a broader set of topics. There's notably one question here, whether there might be exclusion of entities established in member states and how that should work. We've had that discussion in the Digital Europe program and Horizon Europe. The provision indeed exists. Mr. Bütikofer, I would be quite interested also to see with you the approach not now on technologies, but on partners. How do we work with specific partners? I mean, Kurt suggested a positive critical approach. I think that really is what we are trying to do. You probably are aware that we are working with China on establishing a proper framework for engaging more deeply. And to Susanne, Kurt also mentioned the guidelines for research entities. We've been working on those together, and this also connects with a question from the audience on what are member states doing. I mean, this is a discussion at EU level, but member states have policies as well. So if you agree with this maybe short round around these questions, I would start, Roberto, with you.
Many thanks, Jan-Erik. On the practical way forward, first of all, let me remind all the panelists that we didn't start that. We were not the one saying this region first or this kind of things. Unfortunately, the world has turned, especially in high technology, a bit more complicated than it was, and we should not be naive. I heard, I understand what are the concerns, which I share, but at the same time, we have the duty to protect our citizens and our scientists. So the first criteria for me is security. No one should use quantum or space technologies against European interests. So if this is at risk, frankly, this should be a consideration that should be made in terms of selecting the partnership. We want those technologies to be used for peaceful use, for shared use, and no third country, no company outside Europe should use these technologies against us. So I think this is a kind of no-brainer approach in a certain sense. The second element, which is very clear, is that if we have certain technologies which are fundamental to advancing science and research, we must have access to it. We must be able to deliver. So it doesn't mean that we need to do everything ourselves, but if in the analysis, and it was mentioned that we should do a serious analysis, in the analysis emerged that there are critical elements where we need to have a good understanding with partners, then let's have this good understanding. If there's reciprocity, if things are open, there are no export control policies in place, I would not see the problem of liaising and working together with non-EU partners and welcoming companies in the EU which are not owned by EU owners. But if instead, the strict export control rules and there's unclarity about intellectual property, and this might risk that our scientists will not have available the same solution that other scientists will have available, then for me this is a problem. And the third element that we have to make sure that the security of supply for our industries is not a risk. And again, this might be a part of a participative approach. I just take note of the good progress we made at the last summit with the US in terms of agreeing that we will work together in microelectronics. We're agreeing on a trade technology panel to look at these issues. So I think a lot can be done with like-minded partners, but ultimately we have to screen whether our supply chains are resilient enough and are sustainable. And in this respect, the first reflex has always to be, can we do it in partnership especially with like-minded partners.
Roberto, thank you very much, and thanks for underlining indeed, particularly also reciprocity. And this is a challenging discussion, Mr. Bütikofer, we have with China on our future roadmap. So how do you see, China specifically, because you are, of course, a key player here, but also possible advice on other partners and regions?
Indeed, I would argue that reciprocity is a core concern. Everybody knows the proverb, do as you would be done by others. Maybe not everybody knows that this is basically a translation from a quote by Confucius, who used to say, never do to others what you would not like them to do to you. So we have historically, culturally, we have a basis of common understanding on which to build a relationship with a difficult partner like China. China has not been abiding by that principle. I mean, we have to state that just squarely. We have to call a spade a spade. China has been exploiting the relationship. China has been shrouding some of the elements in secrecy. I think it's not a trust-building measure if they send scientists and don't say that these scientists are working on behalf of the Chinese armed forces and that they are here to spy on our technology in order to enhance China's civil military fusion program and to help them in building an even stronger military at the service of their aggressive foreign policy. So transparency and reciprocity have to be the guiding principles. We can't just go for cooperation's sake. What is in it for us? How is a cooperation helping not just our values, but also our interests? You cannot build the relationship with a systemic rival on the basis of blind trust. I would rather sort of paraphrase what Ronald Reagan said, distrust, but verify. And maybe we can have more trust if the implementation of agreed goals really satisfies our expectations. So this is just a necessary level of realism. We cannot fool ourselves. We cannot just pursue a blue-eyed idealist approach. But on the basis of that realism, we can still pursue the search for options for cooperation because there are worthy causes on which to cooperate.
Bütikofer, thank you very much. And this is absolutely the way we are engaging with our partners in Beijing. Reciprocity, transparency. I mean, it's very clear to Commissioner Maria Gabriel, to the Commission, to my teams, that we want to cooperate, and in fact quite intensely with China. The science which is emerging in China is frankly spectacular in many respects, but we need indeed to do it on a proper basis, and that is the challenge ahead of us in the coming weeks and months. Susanne, if I can turn to you, so you heard a lot. I mean, does this interplay with the way this is done at national level, and maybe, as I said, a word on the guidelines for institutions, if you want.
Yes. Thank you, Jean-Eric. And I must say, I can agree to most of what my previous speaker said, and it also shows a bit the dilemma we are in when being more concrete. But anyway, Firstly, I would like to say that there are fields where, of course, cooperation with the whole world is indispensable. Climate change, for example, the big mosaic expedition to the Arctic. Of course, Russia was one of the most important partners, and you have to share all scientific results with them, and they share with us. So I would say that climate change is one of the examples where we really have to be open because it's for the sake of the world in a way. Nevertheless, as a previous speaker said, there has been a kind of naivety in previous times, and therefore, I really appreciate very much our common endeavors, Commission and Member States, to establish guidelines, because I think it's very important that all Member States and the Commission agree on certain basic guidelines for dealing in international cooperation. And what we did during our presidency was establishing the Bonn Declaration of the Freedom of Science, where all Member States and lots of foreign partners joined in. And the difficulty I see is that we have to take the whole scientific community with us and make it transparent that our aim is not to control the freedom of science or to interfere in any case, but what we do is to help them to discover the traps in international corporations, and especially when establishing joint MOUs or something. So we established a whole series in Germany, a whole series of supporting measures to besides what we have in legal restrictions like export control that was already mentioned. But our aim is to make everyone aware of the challenges and the opportunities of international cooperation. So when dealing with one of the systemic rivals, they can approach us and ask, you look at this MOU, are there any traps in there? We do regularly inform higher education institutions about latest developments. We give examples. And so in the end, I think it's creating awareness among the scientific community that besides all let's say, scientific endeavors, and especially one of our systemic rivals are very, as you said, are really excellent partners in science. But what we will enable them just to see if this is a trap or not, and are there elements in these kinds of cooperation MOUs which makes let's say, which is a disadvantage for them. So on the long run, I think common European guidelines where all member states and the Commission have a basis to cooperate and to inform each other about the latest developments, and internally awareness raising within the scientific community. This would help a lot in keeping the right balance between what was already said a lot of times, between openness that is needed for reaching excellence and the best results for our citizens, and beware of any kind of interference that would hamper and be of disadvantage to Europe. So this is in a short cut what we do in Germany. Thank you, Jean-Eric.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Susanna. I think, Kurt, can I come back to you with these guidelines? Because I think these guidelines are absolutely key. They say you need to engage internationally. Your excellence can only thrive if you engage globally. I mean, there is no doubt in anyone's mind on that. And I think in the pandemic, we have paradoxically maybe not seen enough of that, even if there was massive international efforts around genome sequencing at the outset of the pandemic. So that's clearly the direction, but at the same time, without being candid and keeping our eyes open. But this could, of course, also means that in some cases, a university or research organizations might decide that in the end, the cooperation which it used to do or would want to do is not done. I mean, how do you see that dilemma, Kurt?
Absolutely, I fully agree with that. And as I said earlier this week, when we had this session on the guidelines, the guidelines have an enormous value in raising awareness in universities about the potential threats. Over the past year, I have been following very closely the developments in the US, in Canada, in Australia, in the UK, where the problems which we see within universities are even substantially bigger and higher than what we see up until now in Europe, or perhaps in Europe we haven't discovered them. But if I see that in those parts of the world, rectors or presidents of universities today spend more time with people from the national security services than with people that they used to spend their time with, then this is very clearly a very important signal also for us in Europe that we have to take this seriously, that we have to have internal procedures, and that we have to make sure that our leadership, our staff, our students are fully aware of that. How they implement that then in practice, you have done a fantastic set of proposals and suggestions in the guidelines, but then that's up for every university. Now, I would even go a step further, because obviously, because of the legal circumstances and the levels of governance that you are confronted with, at this point in time, I think that in the guidelines, national security services have not been involved yet. I certainly would find it useful if the Commission also could take an initiative vis-à-vis the 27 national security services which are dealing with this, and with which universities also will be confronted if they take domestic measures. I've seen in the US, Canada, Australia, UK, that universities and the university sector have worked intensively with the national security agencies in making sure that they have this under control. So I think it would certainly be very useful if the Commission also there could take an initiative to facilitate also a discussion between those 27 services or more.
Good, thank you very much. That's, I think, one takeaway which I would note. I don't think I would want to reply here on the spot on how to do that, but I think it's a relevant recommendation. Can I ask also Roberto, Mr. Butikofer, Susanne, for one short takeaway before I wrap up? We have about 3 minutes left. Roberto, would you start with one takeaway?
The takeaway is that I think there's a good understanding of what is the problem, what it is at stake, the advantages and disadvantages of moving one direction or another. I think we need to work together with the member states, with the scientific community now to find the right balance. And that is my takeaway for the months to come. And I'm very happy that we have reached this level of maturity and understanding that I'm sure will allow us, together with you, Jean-Eric, and our teams, together with the member states and the community, to find the right solutions.
Roberto, grazie mille. Herr Butikofer.
I would say it's always been the EU's DNA to follow the paradigm of stronger together. Now we have learned that interconnectedness can also be weaponized, and that's why we have to adjust. But we should not fall into the extreme of giving up our philosophy of stronger together and insist on the openness, because that's how we thrive.
Vielen Dank. Susanne.
Yes, thank you. I would promote a very transparent process in defining future, let's say, problems of technological sovereignty between Commission and Member States. And also I would promote transparency about what happens in the Member States with regard to guidelines and foreign interference. This would help a lot, and it would make us stronger as a Europe as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanne. Promoting alignment. This was one of the questions to which you have now replied. Kurt.
Yeah, if I can, one
can.
final point, Jean-Eric. I just would like to make two final issues. First of all, if we as European Union, and I very much support that, if we want to be taking this as a strategy, strategic autonomy for the world, for everything that we do globally, we have to lead by example. So that means that we cannot afford to have problems on those issues within the EU, respecting values, respecting fundamental principles within the EU must be something that we show with all the 27 together. Second point that I just would like to mention still is that if we, in this policy for strategic autonomy, develop criteria, develop all kinds of initiatives, then it will be crucial that we differentiate between countries. Because what we have seen with quantum and space vis-à-vis Switzerland, Israel, the UK, cannot be repeated, I think, in the near future.
Thank you very much, Kurt. Thanks to all four of you. I'm really impressed by where this discussion is today if I contrast it with 6 months ago or a year ago. I think we have collectively really moved forward together. And I think our excellence strides globally. We are not in the autonomy trap. We are keeping our eyes open, there is no doubt about that, and we will very concretely work on criteria as we move forward to ensure that this is practical, focused, and that we can indeed lead by example. Thanks to you very much. Thanks to the audience for your participation, and I wish you a good afternoon, last afternoon of these Research and Innovation Days. See you later.